Hello everyone, welcome back to Review and Rate. Today, we're entering into a world of strong zombies and fast outbreaks. That's right, we're going to play 4 storylines and watch the same cutscenes to talk about Resident Evil 6, a game developed by Capcom and released in 2012. If you're a fan of over-the-top action horror, long playthroughs, and repetitive stories, you won't want to miss this review. Now, let's survive all this destruction and get ready to enter the world of Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6's gameplay is definitely an improvement over RE5, and at times it can be genuinely fun, but other times it quickly becomes exhausting and frustrating. It feels very mixed, especially when you look closely at how its mechanics are designed and used throughout the game. The game does try to bring back more horror compared to RE5, which at first makes you think, okay, maybe Resident Evil is finally returning to its horror roots. Unfortunately, that hope doesn't last long. While zombies and darker environments are present, the game is still far too action heavy to feel truly scary, much like RE5. Even Resident Evil 4, which wasn't nearly as dark visually, managed to feel more tense and unsettling. In RE6, everything is pushed toward over-the-top action and constant destruction. There are small hints of survival horror here and there, but for the most part, this is an action-adventure game. Even moments that should feel classic like finding keys or keycards to open doors lack impact, mainly because exploration is almost non-existent. And yes, that's one of the biggest issues. There is barely any reason to explore in this game. Even RE5 had some incentive to look around, but here there are no in-game story files, no environmental storytelling, nothing meaningful to discover. Exploration is reduced to finding ammo, herbs, and upgrade points. If you're wondering how to progress, the answer is simple. Just follow the objective icon. It tells you exactly where to go and what to do at all times. While this is convenient, it completely kills the sense of discovery, especially when it comes to finding keys or navigating environments naturally. Puzzles do exist, but they are very short, extremely easy, and overall uninteresting. There's nothing here that really challenges the player or feels rewarding to solve. To make things worse, there isn't even a map. One of the core elements that made Resident Evil feel like Resident Evil is completely gone. You don't need to know where you are, just follow the objective marker and move on. Even pausing the game feels wrong. Pausing doesn't truly pause the game. Instead, a menu appears while the game world continues running. Enemies might not attack you, but still feels strange and looks ridiculous. The camera remains in third person over the shoulder, but it's positioned way too close to the character. This is especially noticeable when running, where the camera angles often feel awkward and poorly framed. Then there's the health display, which is honestly one of the worst UI decisions in the game. It looks worse than both RE4 and RE5, and I genuinely don't understand why they changed it. The older health systems work perfectly fine. This one just looks bad and confusing. And yes, they somehow managed to ruin the inventory even more. I already hated RE5's inventory, but this one is worse in a different way. While it does offer more space, which I'll give them credit for, the design is ugly and overly confusing. It took me a long time to understand how it even worked, and something as simple as an inventory should never be this complicated. Just like RE5, there are no manual save files. The game only saves through checkpoints and chapter transitions. Unfortunately, the checkpoint system is still terrible. Every time you die, you respawn in awful places, forcing you to repeat sections you've already completed, which quickly becomes frustrating. At least one improvement deserves credit. Picking up items is much faster now. Unlike RE5, where Chris slowly bent down to grab everything, items are instantly picked up and added to your inventory. It's a small change, but a very welcome one. You can now crouch in multiple ways, giving you more movement options while shooting, which is a welcome addition. This extra mobility makes combat feel more dynamic and flexible compared to previous games. Aiming is also improved over both RE4 and RE5. You can now move freely while aiming, which is a huge improvement, allowing you to stay mobile during fights without feeling slow or restricted. Just like RE5, you can play either solo or in co-op. However, many of the same issues return, such as waiting for your partner to reach certain spots so you can open doors or progress through sections, which can still be frustrating. That said, the friendly AI is much better this time around. Your partner is no longer useless or constantly in trouble. They can defend themselves in tough situations and manage their inventory properly, so they don't run out of ammo like Sheva constantly did in RE5. Thankfully, the game is actually playable solo this time. If you don't enjoy co-op, you don't have to worry about being forced into it, which is a big relief for players like me who prefer playing alone. There are a lot of levels in the game, spread across chapters for each character. While the locations themselves are decent, they quickly lose their impact because you revisit the same areas across multiple storylines. This makes the experience feel repetitive rather than fresh or unique. Even with all that, the game isn't completely unfun. RE6 can be genuinely enjoyable at times, and I actually like the combat quite a lot. The combat is a massive improvement over RE5's terrible system. It feels smoother, more responsive, and far more satisfying. Many encounters genuinely feel good, especially when taking down enemies efficiently. The different zombie types in Leon's and Ada's campaigns are a highlight. It feels good to go back to fighting traditional zombies again, similar to the older Resident Evil games. That said, it's strange that these zombies behave more like Plague's enemies, using weapons and objects against you. It feels odd, but despite that, they are still fun to fight. Melee combat is another big addition. Instead of only performing melee attacks when enemies are stunned, you can now use them freely. There's a wide variety of melee moves, and using enemy objects against them is extremely satisfying. Of course, this system is balanced by the stamina bar, which prevents you from abusing melee attacks constantly. This limitation works well and stops the player from becoming overpowered. However, despite all of this, the gameplay starts to lose its impact over time. What initially feels fun and exciting slowly becomes repetitive. You keep killing enemies, but it starts to feel pointless, with nothing truly pushing you forward or making the combat feel meaningful in the long run. I also didn't enjoy the enemies in Chris's and Jake's campaigns. They feel almost identical to the enemies from RE5, making those sections feel even more repetitive compared to Leon's and Ada's storylines. Boss fights are decent but nothing special. They aren't terrible, but they aren't memorable either. Fighting mutated Derek was fine at first, but having to fight him multiple times, killing him only for him to return again and again, felt unnecessary and dumb, making his encounters more annoying than exciting. As mentioned before, Resident Evil 6 is split into 4 different storylines: Leon and Helena, Chris and Pierce, Jake and Sherry, and finally Ada Wong, who surprisingly is played solo without an AI partner, which honestly makes her campaign feel better in some ways. Out of all of them, Leon's storyline is easily my favorite. It has the best enemies to fight, better locations, and a darker, scarier tone that feels closer to classic Resident Evil compared to Chris or Jake's storylines, which lean much more into action. Ada's storyline, however, mostly feels like a repeat of Leon's campaign. You're often going through the same locations and scenarios, so unless you really want to see things from her perspective or experience her gameplay, there isn't much that feels new there. Splitting the game into 4 separate campaigns was a really bad design choice. I played Leon's and Chris's storylines first, and by the time I finished them, I already felt like I was done with the game. That shouldn't happen in a game that still expects you to play 2 more full campaigns. The game is also way too long for no good reason. It feels like the developers had shorter campaigns in mind but stretched them out just to make the game feel bigger and more complete. Instead, it ends up feeling bloated and exhausting. In my opinion, all 4 storylines should have been merged into one unified campaign. That would have made the experience much tighter and more enjoyable. As it is now, being forced to restart from the beginning with a new character and play similar sections over and over again is just annoying and unnecessary. Because of this structure, you also end up watching the same cutscenes multiple times when different characters cross paths. The first time it happens, it's fine. But after seeing the exact same scenes again and again, it honestly becomes laughable. I remember literally laughing the first time I realized what was happening. It's funny, but also really dumb. There is a lot of fun to be had in Resident Evil 6, especially with its improved combat, but the poor overall design drains much of that fun away over time, turning what could have been an exciting experience into something repetitive and tiring. At the very least, the game does have a cool intro. Here it is.
Resident Evil 6.
So now, let's talk about the story. The story of Resident Evil 6 doesn't really bring anything new to the table. In fact, this is the only Resident Evil game where I genuinely felt like the lore wasn't moving forward at all. While there are a few interesting ideas scattered throughout, the narrative as a whole is weak and repetitive. I would even say the story is worse than Resident Evil 5's, which at least had strong connections to Umbrella, meaningful history with Chris and Jill, and an iconic villain like Wesker. Resident Evil 6 doesn't have any of that weight behind it. Instead, we get yet another villain using bioweapons to cause chaos, a new corporation called Neo Umbrella, and yet another virus, this time the C virus. At this point, it feels like the same story being told again with different names. Nothing about it feels fresh or memorable. The problem is made even worse by the over-the-top action. Characters constantly survive impossible situations, explosions, crashes, and monster attacks, to the point where you completely forget this is supposed to be a horror series. The game doesn't seem to know whether it wants to be serious or self-aware, and that confusion hurts the story badly. Leon in particular doesn't even feel like himself here. He feels like a completely different character compared to the Leon we had in Resident Evil 4. He's mostly boring, his attempts at humor don't land, and his personality feels watered down. Being paired with Helena for most of his campaign doesn't help either, especially since so much of her dialogue revolves around her sister, which just isn't very engaging. Chris is also handled poorly. He's portrayed as depressed and broken before returning to his role fighting bioterrorism. While I understand the idea behind this, it doesn't feel well written or convincing. Even with everything he's been through, this version of Chris doesn't make much sense, especially when compared to his portrayal in Resident Evil 5, where at least he felt like a consistent character. As I mentioned in the gameplay section, splitting the story into 4 separate campaigns only makes everything worse. The narrative jumps around too much, overlaps constantly, and becomes hard to follow. It's difficult to stay invested when the story is told in such a fragmented and repetitive way. That said, there are a few moments I genuinely liked. Seeing main characters finally meet like Leon and Chris was great.
Chris? Leon? What are you doing here?
I also liked seeing Sherry grown up and being protected by Jake, which was one of the more emotionally grounded parts of the story. The large-scale zombie outbreaks, especially in Tall Oaks and China, were also cool to witness from a visual and concept standpoint.
Where are you?
Chris, we're just outside of Tachi. Why?
Get the hell out of there!
Unfortunately, those moments are small highlights in a story that mostly fails to be engaging. To summarize briefly, a secret society leader named Derek Simmons orchestrates global bioterror attacks using the C virus after becoming obsessed with Ada Wong and blaming the US government for her presumed death. He infects the US president to stop the truth about Raccoon City from being revealed, triggering a massive zombie outbreak that forces Leon S. Kennedy to kill him. Simmons also kidnaps Carla Radams and surgically transforms her into a fake Ada Wong. She later rebels, spreads the virus across China, and attempts global destruction. Meanwhile, Chris Redfield fights international bioterror forces while struggling with PTSD after losing his team. A cure is developed using the blood of Jake Muller, the son of Albert Wesker. Carla is killed. Simmons mutates into multiple monsters forms and is eventually defeated. The outbreaks are contained, and once again, the full truth is buried. Now, let's talk about the graphics. The graphics in Resident Evil 6 are definitely an improvement over Resident Evil 5 and look better overall, even if they feel a bit outdated by today's standards. The game has a much darker and more unsettling visual style. Despite all the ridiculous over-the-top action and large-scale destruction, the atmosphere actually feels scarier than Resident Evil 5. which never really looked or felt like a horror game at all. The environments are more detailed, the lighting is moodier, and the overall presentation is far more dramatic. Zombies, creatures, and enemy designs look more disturbing, and the character models are noticeably more detailed and expressive compared to Resident Evil 5. That said, the visuals clearly show their age. While they were impressive at the time, they don't come anywhere close to the quality and polish of the later Resident Evil games, especially once the series moved to a new engine and focused more heavily on horror again. Now, let's talk about the sound. Like most Resident Evil games, the sound design in Resident Evil 6 doesn't really disappoint, and in some areas, it's actually one of the game's biggest strengths. The audio effects are excellent. Gunshots, explosions, creature noises, and environmental sounds all feel impactful and intense, which really fits the game's heavy action focus. Everything sounds loud, dramatic, and polished, helping sell the chaos that's constantly happening on screen. The voice acting, on the other hand, is fine but nothing special. Every actor does a solid job with their character, but there aren't many standard performances here. It gets the job done, and that's about it.
I don't suppose I think you fly a plane, do you?
Chris, the man is a wanted insurgent.
Yes, he's a mercenary, but right now he's under the protection of the US government. He's no threat to the PSAA.
Unless someone pays me to be.
What did you just say?
Where the audio really shines is the soundtrack. Even though Resident Evil 6 leans much more toward action than horror, the music is surprisingly strong. These tracks don't really fit a traditional horror experience, but they're clearly designed for high energy action, and they work very well in that context. The music adds tension, intensity, and momentum to the gameplay, making fights feel bigger and more cinematic. Here, listen to some of these tracks.
You really shouldn't have ditched the helicopter. Ada!
Showing up!
Hurry! Okay, that's enough climbing.
You're going down, Simmons!
Now, let's move on to the final section, replayability. When it comes to replayability, Resident Evil 6 does offer a decent number of options on paper, but in practice, it's surprisingly hard to find a real reason to come back to the game. Some of these mods are fun to have, yet none of them feel strong enough to carry the experience long term. One of the more unique additions is Agent Hunt, a mode where you control a zombie and invade other players' campaigns. It's a fun idea and can be entertaining for a while, but feels more like a novelty than something you'll keep playing regularly. Then there's the Mercenaries, which is easily better here than it was in Resident Evil 5. It's faster, smoother, and more enjoyable overall, and this is probably the mode with the most replay value in the entire game. You can also access the files and cutscenes you unlock, but this is handled in a strange way. Instead of finding and reading files naturally during gameplay, everything is locked behind menus. On top of that, if you play all 4 storylines, you'll already be overwhelmed with cutscenes, making this feature feel unnecessary rather than rewarding. There is also New Game Plus, where everything carries over into a second playthrough, along with a chapter select option that lets you replay specific sections. While this is nice to have, I personally wasn't very interested in playing the game, especially since playing all 4 campaigns already made it feel like I was replaying the same experience multiple times. But now, let's wrap everything up with my overall impression. Resident Evil 6 is a deeply mixed experience. It offers moments of fun, solid gameplay ideas, improved visuals, and genuinely great sound design. But all of that is dragged down by a terrible and unfocused story, messy pacing, and a design that constantly works against itself. Just like Resident Evil 5, this game leans far too heavily into action, abandoning the horror identity that defined the series in the first place. While Resident Evil 6 tries to do everything, multiple campaigns, non-stop spectacle, and over-the-top set pieces, it ends up doing very little well. The result is a bloated, repetitive experience that feels exhausting rather than exciting. There is fun to be found here, especially in short bursts, but as a complete package, Resident Evil 6 is poorly designed and confused about what it wants to be. It doesn't fully commit to horror, doesn't fully succeed as an action game, and ultimately feels like another disappointing step for the franchise. Because of that, it earns a slightly better score than Resident Evil 5, but it's still far from being a good Resident Evil game. Here is my final score. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more insightful review videos. Feel free to share your thoughts on whether the points I've raised resonate with you or if you have a different perspective. And leave your suggestions in the comments about which game you'd like to see reviewed next. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you all for watching.